I'm Laura Dawson. I'm the director of the Canada Institute at the Wilson Centre. I have the greatest job in the world. I am a Canadian and I get to direct the only institute that focuses on nothing but the broad spectrum of Canada-US issues. So I am delighted. Every day I go to work excited about my job. This is a great conference. I'm delighted to be with two great friends on stage here. Delighted to respond to the call of Dan Utso, who's like the mayor of Canada-US relations. His energy and his determination are extraordinary. I think that's why many of us are here today. The problem is I agree with these folks far too much. And so I decided to take the contrarian role, the skunk in the garden party. Which it comes from a valid place, I think. I am not really much of an academic. I did spend 12 years in university one day, but I have worked primarily as an advisor to governments, as an advisor to the US government, as a locally engaged staff member at the US Embassy in Ottawa, as an advisor to the Canadian government through various contracts and operations. And I worked for 3 years as a card-carrying lobbyist. You can check my name on lobbying registrations on both sides. So I have worked with stakeholders, I have worked with businesses, and every day of my work for the past umpteen years has been focused on advancing this relationship, and in particular advancing the Canada-US economic relationship. And over the last several years, this has been a really distressing and frustrating exercise. The days of big think and big initiatives and big ideas, the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, the NAFTA, the St. Lawrence Seaway, International Joint Commission, Auto Pact, those days are over. And now Chris and I and many of the people in this room, we get called by government officials, and this is not an indictment on government officials, by the way. We get called by government officials and they say, hey, we're having a leader summit, we're having a bilateral meeting, we're having a something to talk about the future of the relationship. What recommendations do you have? And Chris and I were discussing this recently over lunch. Our recommendation is free movement of goods, services, people, and investment and ideas across all three borders with no barriers. That's our recommendation, the promise of the NAFTA. Exactly. And these, but the officials that we talk to, who are reflecting their bosses and their political bosses' imperatives, say, no, don't be ridiculous. Haven't you heard of Congress? Haven't you heard of immigration rules? Haven't you heard of on the Canadian side, the importance of the dairy lobby in Quebec? Haven't you heard of the importance of, protecting softwood lumber? Haven't you heard of the role of the provinces? Every time we come up with the big suggestions, we are said, no, think smaller, think non-political, think under the radar, think incremental. And we've been getting pretty creative at this, and we've come up with some pretty good ideas. The folks in this room, many of you have all been involved in this process. But pretty soon, we're going to be down to butterflies and migratory birds because there is just a real absence of political leadership. And yes, we have lots of handshakes and we have lots of photo ops, but we do not have any investment of political currency into making this relationship bigger and better and fulfilling the sort of promise that I think all of us in this room agree on. So what are we left with? Ad hoc, incrementalism, under the radar operations. So I'm going to argue for a while, using Chris's principles, that ad hoc incrementalism works pretty well, and is probably the best we can hope for. So let's see how that goes. All right, first principle, partnership. All right, equals, yes, that's a given. But Canadians in particular wax on about the special relationship and that Canada ought to have some sort of priority in US decision making and that we are first among equals, including listening to a State of the Union address and counting how many times Canada is not mentioned in the address, and when the US president talks about the US greatest friends and allies, if we're not in that top 3 list, we get very, very upset. So there's this special relationship notion in Canada that is just not played out in political reality. The institutional organization of the U.S. government is such that Canada is dealt with in a Western Hemisphere Affairs Bureau. So Mexico, Canada, and the rest of Latin America are lumped in together. There is no special Canada Bureau for thinking about advancing the special relationship. At the local level, absolutely. There are much stronger partnerships between Canada and the U.S. at the local, at the provincial, at the state, at the municipal level. Again, keeping in mind Jim Phillips' point, within 100 miles of the U.S. northern border, a great deal of embeddedness. But at the top level, very little consideration of anything beyond a partnership, no special relationship. Canada, I have argued, is a minimal foreign policy actor in the United States. Canada's foreign policy influence is very, very small. But Canada is probably the most influential foreign country affecting U.S. domestic policy. Every single day there are phone calls between Department of Commerce and Industry Canada, Department of Transport, Transport Canada, USDA, Canadian Agriculture. At the technical and local level, particular level, we are embedded in each other's economies and day-to-day activities. Nobody else, no other country, not Germany, not Australia, has that kind of access and influence over U.S. domestic policymaking. So that's important, and I think that's something to keep in mind. Interdependence. So yes, I agree with Chris's principle about about interdependence. It generates mutual advantages, but it also generates mutual vulnerabilities. Canadians know very well the dangers of having one big trading partner. What happens when that trading partner's fortunes dissipate? Your economy tanks as well. And so Canada, in the 70s, considered the third option diversification policy, pretty much rejected that, but has reconsidered that and is actively pursuing trade relationships outside of the U.S. purview. Was the first to sign an agreement with the European Union, is considering, I believe, a new agreement with China, and is operating outside of the U.S. sphere in order to diversify. And I think that's necessary for longevity. We do have a number of interdependent institutions that operate, again, International Joint Commission, how we operate our bridges, how we operate our transportation corridors, how we operate any number of technical, scientific, health, safety operations. These are institutions that are basically self-sustaining. They continue because there's a demand from stakeholders to continue to operate them. They require very little external tweaking. Rule of law. We have Maureen Irish from the University of Windsor, law professor here, so she could talk about this much better than I can. But yes, there is a functional dispute settlement mechanism that operates for Canada when we've got, and the U.S. when there's a dispute, country of origin labeling, softwood lumber, Buy America. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But the Canada-U.S. rule of law relationship is really no different, no more exceptional or in particular than U.S. relations with UK, U.S. relations with Japan. And a rule of law dispute settlement process works until there are particularized, entrenched national interests that say, hey, wait a minute, no, we are not willing to move on softwood. We are not willing to move on dairy. We are not willing to move on country of origin labeling. The greatest advantage Canada has is not at the high-level dispute settlement mechanisms, but rather in the fact that Canada and the U.S. have developed compatible, similar commercial legal systems, commercial operational systems. So we have a fair amount of interoperability, which makes it easy for investors to do business on both sides of the border. So that's an advantage that Canada does have. But that's, again, at that local level. And of course, you'll be hearing tonight about regulatory alignment, which I would argue is the most important Canada-U.S. economic initiative that is currently in operation. It is really under the radar, requires very little political intervention, but does a great deal and will continue to do a great deal for this relationship by lowering transaction costs for cross-border traders. Institutionalization. Yes, Chris's point that greater economic interdependence should lead to greater bilateral institutionalization to stem the propensity for intergovernmental conflict or market intervention and make outcomes predictable and less politically dependent. Yes, institutions work, except when they don't work, except when there's pressure at the local level because you have competition from Canada or you have competition from the United States, and this generates pressure for protectionism. This is exactly what you see being played out in the current presidential campaign. There will always be limits to cooperation. Institutions require a contribution of sovereignty. You know, when you sign a regulatory alignment deal on the size of a label on a life jacket, that means that you cede your Canadian authority over making that label 1 centimeter larger or 1 centimeter smaller. This may seem like a small deal, but it's still ceding sovereignty over a particular area of competence. And governments generally are quite reluctant to do this. At the same time, the way that we are progressing with ad hoc arrangements, short-term arrangements, it means that we have flexibility to implement certain policies for a short period of time and then step away from them once something better comes along. And so that seems to be the status of the relationship now, is more of an ad hoc, easy in, easy out, but generally low political impact, low political demand type policies. Linkage. I learned more about linkage when I was inside of government than I was outside of government. And I agree entirely that it is not a recommended strategy. My limited experience is that it hardly ever takes place until it does. You never want to be in a situation where you're asking the auto sector to trade off their interests for the dairy sector, or heaven forbid, you are holding a military or security investment hostage to some benefit for lumber. I mean, can you imagine how it's really inconceivable. It's a weak and unpredictable strategy, but it's a strategy nonetheless. Sometimes there is a judgment call where a leader will say, Canada, what have they done for us lately? Oh, that fill in the blank. He's such a jerk. I don't think so. Oh, that fill in the blank. Prince of a guy. Let's go ahead and give him what he wants. So sometimes the reputation, the contribution, the what have you done for me lately forces really do influence policy. But it wouldn't want to be, I wouldn't want to hold hang your hat on it if I were advising you as a government relations or advocacy expert. But you still have to be cognizant of that tone in the relationship. What's more effective are cross-border coalitions. Again, when I was doing advocacy work, if I could find a group of American businesses and a group of Canadian businesses that wanted the same thing, and I could take the Canadian businesses in to meet Canadian MPs and the American businesses in to meet US members of Congress, we were golden because we were operating effectively on both sides of the border. So those cross-border coalitions, especially when you include strong state and provincial input, that really affects change more than any single thing I can think of to advance the relationship. If you have 4 states and 2 provinces in agreement on something, if you've got a municipal area combined population of 7 or 8 million on both sides of the border saying, yes, we want this, that thing will happen if you organize yourself effectively. Independence and nationalism. Yes. A stronger and more independent Canada is good for the United States and bilateral relations, but nationalistic policies on either side will tend to sour the relationship. I don't see strong nationalistic policies on the side of Canada. It's more of a sibling relationship that I see. You guys don't give us enough respect. You don't know where Canada is. Don't you know how important we are? We are, for better or worse, the little brother struggling to get attention and introducing rivalries. There are also differences in approach in the way that we make policy and the way we execute policy. Canadians tend to be very incremental. We like to develop a work plan. We like to develop a schedule for how we're going to meet this work plan, and we're going to meet with you all Americans every 3 months, and we're going to tick the boxes, and it's going to be fine, and we're going to get from A to Z in a prescribed amount of time. The American approach is nothing. We're not interested. Nah, you're not in the agenda. No, still busy. Call us again, 6 months. No. Okay, how about a bilateral, comprehensive border cooperation strategy that includes multi-sectoral regulatory alignment? You guys up for that? And Canadians go, whoa, wait a minute, where'd that come from? So the US tends to take giant leaps that freak Canada out a little bit. Canada tends to be more incremental, but Canada also tends to do the homework and do the planning and doing the sort of work on both sides of the table to advance an agenda item forward. And I think that is a very compatible relationship. I'm not sure any of the academic works have ever captured it, but it works. And so giant leaps plus incrementalism actually help to generate progress. Also, nationalism, I think, doesn't really capture the important role of the provinces in Canada as influencing Canadian policy or blocking Canadian federal policy, having a similar effect to the US Congress to either facilitate or impede executive level decisions. Criticism. In the absence of special interests or obligations, avoid as far as possible public disagreement, especially on critical issues. I think that it is fair game to criticize policies in a respectful, constructive way that affect your interests, affect your region's or your country's interests. Going into the political sphere and saying, that candidate, he or she is such a bum, that's a really bad idea, and that does not promote constructive diplomatic or policy relationships. Leaders. The relationship is much deeper than relations between leaders, but leaders set the tone. I've been really surprised in Washington how much of a difference Trudeau has made. Trudeau's policies, Trudeau's actions have been pretty thin. There have not been a huge number of things, at least things that affect the Canada-US relationship. But all of a sudden it's like, wow, you guys have a great prime minister. Wow, it's a brand new day in Canada-US relations. And so that has opened a door for renewed consideration of bilateral issues. It's not that Trudeau and Obama are necessarily proposing them or agreeing on them, but it has set a tone for other levels of government to work on. And it has made a bigger difference than I thought it would. So tone is important. At the same time, you can get things done with leaders who don't like each other. The relationship between Obama and Harper was strained, but a lot of things got done between those two leaders. A lot of things famously did not get done. A lot of, speaking of tone, a lot of things got done during the 1960s, even though the relationship between Lyndon B. Johnson and Lester Pearson was famously bad. The famous quote by Johnson telling Pearson not to talk about the U.S. at the UN was, "You peed on my rug?" And that's fairly pointed. At the same time, the historians tell us that the relationship between Mulroney and Reagan was so strong that Reagan's advisors were reluctant to tell him that Mulroney was on the phone because Reagan could not say no to that guy. And so that relationship may have helped facilitate the conclusion of the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. Diffusion. This is what I argue, that more in the relationship takes place below the surface than above it, that the Canada-US relationship is strongest at the level of stakeholder engagement, community engagement, domestic political, economic affairs. And the high level is really, it's important to set the tone, it's important to set broad directions, but most of the relationship gets done under the surface, which is why we're meeting in Columbus, Ohio, to talk about the Canada-US relationship. Friendship. The most important relationships that we have focus on things like families and communities. All Canadians have an American cousin. Everybody goes across the border for a hockey game if they live near the border. Cities, regions. I remember the ice storm in Ottawa, seeing utility trucks from the United States going down my street. Remember Katrina cleanup, seeing Canadian emergency workers. That is how we're embedded. And also regions, supply chains, and of course, sports teams. So what's so great about ad hoc incrementalism? On the one hand, you can get things done if nobody's paying a whole lot of attention to you. The Japanese proverb is, a nail that sticks out will be hammered. You know, the foreign policy partners that the US pays attention to, the Iraqs and the Syrias and the Chinas, they don't do so well. Maybe it's better to stay under the radar. But at the same time, if you are under the radar, you don't get those big ideas. You don't get cooperation. You don't get the economies of scale that we need to really drive the relationship forward. Our agenda of actionable items gets smaller and smaller and smaller until we're down to migratory birds. Not that those aren't important, but that's not all there is. Our pool of substantive but non-controversial ideas are running low. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect, of course, we have to think about is this is not a bilateral relationship anymore. Like it or not, Mexico is a very important third component in the Canada-US relationship. So we cannot conceive of new policies, new actions without considering how Mexico will or will not be included in these actions. So the US is going into a period of uncertainty. Doubt and fear just ahead. I do not expect that there will be any change to ad hoc incrementalism anytime soon. But maybe through meetings like this, we will be able to move past that into a more productive, more visionary area of cooperation. And again, I think that our most productive area of operation, our strength comes from our communities, comes from our families, comes from our cross-border relationships between people. I apologize, this is not a Canada-US assistance picture. This is actually a First Nations guy assisting evacuees from Fort McMurray. But it's an example of how we all get along. Just drove out to the side of the road with jerry cans full of gasoline, boxes of diapers, water, and just helping out whoever comes along, because that's the kind of neighbors they are, and that's the kind of neighbors we are. Thank you.
Okay, so Jim, would you put up the last poll, please? We just heard a lot of different ideas for principles that may be more relevant in guiding the relationship. Incrementalism, ad hoc, subnational, style, trilateralism, communities. You have your own ideas. You now have the opportunity to actually type in up to 3 responses. What new principles capture the Canada-US relationship? Wow, still partnership.
What hockey up there?
Ad hoc. No ad hoc. There's China. Look at. Okay. Partnership people.
Mexico?
No. Oh, there's ad hoc. Okay.
Tiffany, you gotta put Mexico on there.
Okay, about 30 more seconds because I think we're running a few minutes over. East. Okay. All right.
This is very addictive. I could see doing this all day.
Okay. So does anybody want to comment on Laura's remarks, Chris's remarks, where you see the relationship moving forward with regard to the foundations, right? Nobody has any critique or commentary right now? That's okay, that's great. It's our intention that this conversation was a starter for the next 2.5 days, and that we will continue to think about the foundations of the relationship. Again, after the event, we are going to pull all of this information together into a document, send that out for critique and commentary to make sure that we've captured everything from the bottom up. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you.